October 25th, 1985. Bottom of the ninth, Game 6 of the World Series. Cardinals up 3-2 and leading 1-0 with Todd Worrell on the mound, 3 outs from a championship. Jorge Orta steps in and hits a slow grounder towards first. Jack Clark fields it and flips it underhand to Worrell covering the bag, and the ball gets there ahead of Orta by half a step. First base umpire Don Denkinger calls him safe. The Royals came back to win that game 2-1, then blew St. Louis out 11-0 in Game 7, and Kansas City had a World Series title. Denkinger admitted later he got it wrong. Commissioner Peter Ueberroth told him to his face in the hallway outside the locker room that same night, but none of it changed anything. Because in 1985, there was no review system, no challenge, nothing in the rulebook that gave anyone the ability to fix an obvious mistake after it happened. The call stood, and it always stood. Denkinger said years later, if it had happened now, they'd review it and overturn it, just like that. But baseball didn't have just like that yet, and the franchise lost a World Series mostly because of it. That's what the sport was for most of its history, and in 2026, it's something completely different. On the field, baseball might be the most fairly officiated major professional sport in this country right now. The problem, and there is a problem, is what's happening off of it. But before we get to that, why is baseball arguably the most fair sport? To get to that, we have to talk about balls and strikes, because I think a lot of people genuinely underestimate how central it is to the whole fairness problem. It's not like a close play at first base or a disputed catch in the outfield, which happen a few times a game at most. The ball and strike call happens on every single pitch a batter doesn't swing at, which is quite a lot of them, and it compounds to affect everything downstream. One pitch changes a count changes an at-bat changes an inning. A pitcher who's getting the outside corner all game is a different pitcher than one who isn't. His stuff is just going to play differently and his approach is going to be different. A hitter who gets consistently squeezed by a particular umpire's tendencies is dealing with something that will never show up anywhere in the box score. And for the entire history of professional baseball, the only check on any of that was one person's real-time judgment with no accountability whatsoever. I do want to be fair to umpires here, because there's a version of this conversation where we just dunk on them, and that's not the point I want to make. When you're watching at home with a glowing strike zone overlay that updates in a quarter of a second, it's very easy to forget that umpires don't have that. They've got their eyes, their positioning, and about a third of a second to decide whether a 97-mile-per-hour cutter with a late arm side run caught the inside corner or missed it by an inch. That's extremely difficult. I couldn't do it. You probably couldn't do it either. And if you do think you could, you've never tried. But hard doesn't mean unquestionable, and once pitch tracking technology got good enough to generate real data on how often umpires were getting these calls wrong, the numbers were very uncomfortable. A Boston University study analyzing nearly 4 million pitches using StatCast and PitchEffects data found that in 2018 alone, MLB umpires made 34,294 incorrect balls and strike calls. That's 14 per game, or 1.6 per inning, and 55 games that season ended on a wrong call. And these aren't randomly distributed errors. Umpires have documented tendencies that players and coaches prepare for. Some give veterans more of the corners, some have wider zones when a game is out of hand, some squeeze when they feel a pitcher is nibbling instead of attacking. There's an entire layer of game planning in professional baseball that exists purely because the effective strike zone shifts depending on who's behind the plate, and for over a century, everyone just accepted that. The other major American sports were not this patient with themselves. The NFL put in a replay system in 1986, the same year the Mets last won a championship. The NHL started reviewing disputed goals in 1991. The NBA had some form of replay capability by 2002, and all three of those leagues built systems that have mattered in real moment. But what a lot of people don't realize when they bring up those other sports as a standard is having a replay system and having a complete solution are two very different things. And to this day, none of these have been fully solved either. The NFL still cannot use replay to fix a missed penalty call. The most famous case in recent years is the 2019 NFC Championship, where Rams cornerback Nickel Roby Coleman drilled Saints receiver Tommy Lee Lewis before the ball arrived, helmet to helmet, and it was obvious pass interference, but no flag was thrown. The Rams won in overtime, and the Saints never got to go to the Super Bowl. The NFL's own head of officials called Sean Payton the next day and said flat out, "We messed it up." Roby Coleman himself admitted he was there too early. The league admitted it in court, and there was nothing anyone could do because the NFL's replay system couldn't touch penalty calls. They tried to fix it in 2019 by making pass interference reviewable, but it was a subjective, inconsistent disaster that they scrapped after 1 year. As of 2026, the NFL is still debating whether to let booth officials throw late flags for clear misses, and there are still things to figure out. Spotting a ball is now done with electronic measurements, instead of just using the ref's eye test, and I'm sure there'll be more things to review later on as we get better technology and better ideas. The NBA has replay for out-of-bounds calls and flagrant fouls, but every actual foul call during live play is still entirely in the hands of officials making split-second judgment calls on contact. The league publishes last 2-minute reports after close games that routinely confirm missed calls that change outcomes, and every season those reports fuel a new round of outrage. Players get fined for calling out specific referees by name. Coaches get ejected for arguing calls that the league's own post-game report later confirms were wrong. The subjectivity baked into foul decisions in basketball runs so deep that there's no clean technical fix. A ball strike call has a box you can check. A foul call doesn't. Baseball, meanwhile, the sport with the most games per season, and the most individual plays and calls made per game, waited until 2008 to implement any replay at all, and even then it only covered one thing, which was disputed home runs. Every other call, whether it was safe or out, fair or foul, and non-home run plays, catch or trap, was still the umpire's call. It was final, there was no appeal, and no amount of arguing could change it. Now, the argument for staying there when we had better technology at the time was that there was always the human element. Mistakes are part of the game, and unpredictability makes baseball what it is, which I understand as a position, but I'd have more respect for it if baseball hadn't already changed the mound height, banned the spitball, added the designated hitter, and adjusted about 100 other things when the situation called for it. The tradition being protected when it came to replay wasn't really about to solve the sport, it was just to keep umpire authority unquestionable, and that tradition mostly served the people who didn't have to live with the wrong calls. The turning point was 2014. Baseball dramatically expanded the replay system that year. Managers got one challenge per game, and they kept it if they won. And contested plays went to a review crew in New York looking for every available camera angle for safe and out, fair and foul, interference, catch or trap. Still couldn't touch balls and strikes, but it was more than the sport had ever had before, and it wasn't even close. Go back to 1985 with 2014 rules. Whitey Herzog watches Denkinger call Orta safe and uses a challenge. New York sees what every TV viewer at home already saw. The ball was in Worrell's glove before Orta's foot hit the bag, and it wasn't even close. Call overturned, that runner doesn't get on base, the Cardinals likely win that game, which means they win the World Series, and Denkinger doesn't spend the rest of his career defined by one call he had no ability to fix. The Cardinals franchise history looks different, the Royals history looks different, all of that from one play that nobody at the time had any way to correct. And then there's Armando Galarraga, which is something that still bothers me to this day. June 2nd, 2010, at Comerica Park in Detroit, Galarraga is on the mound for the Tigers against Cleveland, and he started that year in the minors, worked his way back into the rotation, and he was not a name that most people knew. But that night, he retired the first 26 batters he faced, and with 1 out left in the ninth, Jason Donald hit a ground ball to first, Miguel Cabrera fielded it, and Galarraga caught it with Donald still a full step away. Jim Joyce, the first base umpire, called him safe. What makes this one stick differently than Denkinger is how Galarraga took it. He didn't charge Joyce, he didn't scream, he didn't do any of the things you'd expect from someone who just had a perfect game taken away from him. I know I would have lost it at the umpire if I was there. But then Galarraga retired the next batter, and that was it. A complete game shutout, but not a perfect game. Joyce went into the locker room after the game, watched the replay, and admitted to reporters that he cost him a perfect game. In an ESPN poll of 100 current MLB players taken that same week, Jim Joyce was voted the best umpire in baseball. He was excellent at his job, but that didn't matter. The following offseason, the Tigers designated Galarraga for assignment. He bounced around Arizona and Houston for a couple years, and then he was out of the big leagues for good. He and Joyce eventually co-wrote a book together called Nobody's Perfect, and Joyce went back out to work the plate the very next day. Both of them handled an impossible situation better than most people would have, but none of it gave Galarraga his perfect game back, and everyone knows that it was unfair. Same problem underneath both stories 25 years apart. Not necessarily bad umpires, because both of these umpires were very well respected, but just one bad decision in one moment changed the course of history for players, entire teams. And that was it. I remember when I was around 9 years old, watching a Yankees-Orioles game in 2012, and Mark Teixeira hit a grounder that turned into a double play with the bases loaded. Except when you watch the replay, when Teixeira dove headfirst into first, he was safe by a lot. That changed the outcome of the game, and that made 9-year-old me really angry because I was wondering, why can't things like this be challenged? We had good cameras at the time, it's not ancient history. We clearly had the technology to see that that was the wrong call, but nothing could be done. When the challenge system was implemented in 2014, it changed everything. But that was 12 years ago, and we already went over things this could have changed and what this does. But where are we in 2026? The automated ball strike challenge system, otherwise known as ABS, had been running in the minor leagues for years before it got to the majors, which meant it wasn't some untested experiment. There was multiple years of refinement, figuring out what broke and fixing it. MLB's competition committee approved it for the big league in September 2025, and it debuted in opening night of 2026 when the Yankees played the Giants in the first ever regular season MLB broadcast on Netflix, which is a lot of firsts for one evening. Also, one more quick thing worth mentioning is that there is an electronic pitch calling system to prevent cheating, Astro style. Picking up signs is and has never been against the rules, but stealing signs with cameras is and can't even be done for the most part now since most pitchers use this electronic system. So on the field in 2026, baseball is the most fairly officiated it's ever been, and honestly, probably the most fairly officiated of any major American sport right now. The NFL still can't fix a missed penalty. The NBA still publishes post-game reports confirming wrong calls in a close game. Baseball can now challenge whether a pitch was a ball or strike, and then within 15 seconds get an answer within 0.39 inches of accuracy. But that's a different category. The Denkinger situation can't play out the same way. Galarraga can't have his perfect game taken by an uncorrectable call. This took decades of resistance and came later than it should have, but it did happen. At the same time though, the financial structure of the sport has never been more lopsided, and this is where I found myself more conflicted than I expected when I started thinking about this video. Payroll inequality in baseball is not a new conversation. Big market teams have always spent more, small market teams less, And the gap between the Yankees and the A's has been a feature of the sport since before most of us were born. What's changed is the scale, and specifically what the Dodgers figured out how to do inside a system that was never built to stop them. The NFL, NBA, and NHL all have hard salary caps, which is a ceiling every team hits at the same point, meaning no ownership group can simply outspend everyone else into irrelevance. Baseball has the competitive balance tax instead, which most people call the luxury tax, and it works very differently. The 2026 threshold is $244 million. Go over it and you pay a tax on every dollar above the line. 20% your first consecutive year over, 30% the second, 50% for 3 or more years in a row. There's additional surcharge tiers layered on for larger overages, and an extra 12% once you're $20 million above the threshold, another tier at $40 million over, and teams that finish $40 million or above the threshold also lose draft positioning. The Dodgers, Yankees, and Mets are all at the 50% base rate in 2026 because they've been over the threshold for at least 3 years straight. To put that in concrete dollars, a team finishing $50 million over the threshold for the 3rd consecutive year is paying 50% on the first $20 million of overage, 50% plus a 12% surcharge on the next $20 million, and a high rate on anything beyond that plus draft pick penalties. The Dodgers' payroll in 2026 is estimated above $375 million against a $244 million threshold, an overage of over $130 million. Their tax bill is projected to set records, and they are still building the way they're building, because for an organization with the Dodgers' revenue base, the luxury tax is just a toll you pay to use the road, rather than just a wall that stops you from driving. Before getting to what the Dodgers specifically did, the Brewers deserve a moment here because they're the strongest case that the system still works for small market teams. Milwaukee has been building genuine contenders for years on a payroll a fraction of what the Dodgers carry, through smart drafting, player development, and creative roster construction. Cleveland does it, the Rays do it. There are plenty of small market teams that have been competing, but there's a difference between small market teams can find ways to win and the sport is structurally balanced. And the Ohtani situation really brought up a lot of questions here. Ohtani is probably the best baseball player on the planet now, you could argue Judge, but regardless, he's a top 2 baseball player in the world. He pitches at an ace level and hits at an MVP level simultaneously, something that no one in the modern era, or really ever, has done to this level. He's already won 4 MVPs and will probably win more before his career is over. So when Juan Soto signed with the Mets for $765 million over 15 years, to get an idea of Ohtani's contract, let's look at some other players. So Soto signed the year after Ohtani signed with the Dodgers for $765 million over 15 years. That comes out to $51 million per year. And then Kyle Tucker signed this offseason with the Dodgers for $60 million a year. Now, if you're doing math, you're probably thinking that he makes more than that, but not exactly. He makes $2 million a year. Not even $20 million. $2 million. Anthony Volpe makes more than that. There are pre-arbitration players, guys who haven't even established themselves in the big leagues yet, who make more than the best baseball player in the world. The reason is that Ohtani signed with the Dodgers for $700 million over 10 years, which is $70 million per year, but deferred $680 million of it. He gets almost nothing while he's playing for them, and then the real money comes later after the contract ends, and payments spread across future years long after he's retired. For luxury tax purposes, his annual hit on the Dodgers payroll is almost nothing, which means they get the best player in the world at the peak of his career, and he barely registers on the book. Deferrals aren't new. Bobby Bonilla is the most famous one. The Mets owed him $5.9 million in 2000 and worked out a deal to instead pay him about $1.19 million every July 1st from 2011 through 2035, years after his last game in 2001. The Bobby Bonilla contract has kind of become just an annual July meme where everyone just laughs at the Mets, and now the Mets even embrace it. But this is nothing compared to Ohtani. While this is around $30 million, Ohtani is getting $680 million after, and because of this, Dodgers were able to later add Blake Snell with his 2 Cy Young awards, Edwin Diaz, an all-star closer, Kyle Tucker, an all-star outfielder, on top of a rotation that has Ohtani, and then 2 more pitchers getting a crazy amount of money, and Yoshinobu Yamamoto and Roki Sasaki, 2 Japanese superstars, and of course there's other deals like Freddie Freeman. And also I do have to mention, Ohtani is not the only one getting deferrals. In fact, it's around $1 billion of deferred money that the Dodgers have, and that's in addition to having a top payroll in the MLB, but the fact that all this money is deferred lets them make even more moves. And none of this breaks any rules either. The CBA doesn't cap deferrals. There's no restriction on how far into the future you could push payment. Deferrals also cost Ohtani money in real economic terms, because the present value of money you receive in 2040 is substantially lower than money you receive today. So he's essentially being paid less than the $700 million headline, and both sides knew what they were doing when signing, because Ohtani already makes a ridiculous amount of money in sponsorships and everything else, that he clearly just wanted to help the Dodgers put together a winning team. But what makes this different from a normal front office edge is that most franchises can't pull it off even if they wanted to. And not because the rules stop them, it's that no player with Ohtani's options is going to defer $680 million to an organization they don't fully trust to be stable for the next 20, 30 plus years. The Marlins can't make that offer. The A's can't. The franchises that can realistically make this work, roughly the franchise is already at the top of the revenue hierarchy because they can commit to that kind of spending. Plus at this point, with Dodgers committing money to everyone and practically getting every player they want, if a player wants to win, they're going to go to the Dodgers. Blake Snell even said, if you can't beat him, join him. And since Ohtani, they've signed the 2 Japanese superstar pitchers I already mentioned, and it didn't even seem like any other team had a chance. The Dodgers won the World Series 2 years ago, then they won it again last year, becoming the first team to repeat since the 98 to 2000 Yankees. Going into 2026, they opened as the shortest preseason World Series favorites of any team in the last 20 years. Odds around plus 200 for most books. The Dodgers have broke baseball, but they haven't broken any rules. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. The Dodgers aren't cheating, they just found the biggest available gap in the financial structure of baseball, and they're operating inside of it, which is what good organizations do. Ohtani chose this structure. His representation signed off knowing exactly what it meant, and the MLBPA fought for decades to avoid a hard salary cap, and they're not wrong that cap suppressed salaries for the best players, and no cap is what they got. What the Dodgers are doing is just what no cap looks like when a smart, well-capitalized organization figures out how to maximize it, and you can't really be mad at them for just doing something so well. At the same time, the luxury tax was supposed to do something. It was supposed to make dramatically outspending everyone expensive enough that most teams would think twice, but the Dodgers have not thought twice. They've assembled a roster that doesn't look like it belongs in the same competitive universe as the bottom third of baseball, and the mechanism designed to discourage that is doing exactly what the taxes critics always said it would, which is acting as a pricing mechanism for organizations rich enough to pay it, not an actual limit on anyone. Now the Brewers can compete, Tampa Bay can compete, good small market teams do find a way, but it seems like the gap is only widening, that it's going to become even more difficult for these teams to compete with the top dogs. Hell, it's even become difficult for teams like the Yankees, the Mets, the Phillies, teams with super high payrolls to even compete with the Dodgers. I think it's very interesting how baseball spent the better part of 40 years slowly, reluctantly, sometimes badly fixing the part of the sport you could see, dragging officiating from one guy's opinion to something that could be challenged. They did it with enormous resistance at every step and took way longer than it should have. Denkinger admitted he blew that call in 1985 and died in 2023, and in the nearly 40 years in between, baseball built something that means it won't happen the same way again. Well, unless the team has lost their challenge, but at that point, if they lost a challenge, in most cases it's on them, but the challenge system still isn't perfect. The financial side is a harder problem, partly because the people who need to agree to fix it are largely the same people who benefit most from leaving it alone. The current CBA expires this year, and there's a labor negotiation coming, and we don't know what's going to happen. If the Dodgers win the World Series again this year, I would say that a strike is even more likely, because other organizations are just going to get more tired of this if they're not already. On the field in 2026, baseball is as fair as it's ever been though. Every pitch is tracked, every close play reviewable. The part you actually watch is run with a precision that would have been unimaginable to anyone in the 1985 World Series press box, or to the 9-year-old me watching Teixeira get called out at first with no idea why nothing could be done about it. The part that happens before the first pitch, in conference rooms, in contract negotiations, in decisions about how to structure $680 million worth of future obligations, that's a whole different ballgame, and baseball doesn't have an answer for it yet. I just want to say if you made it to the end of this video and enjoyed, please subscribe, because I'm trying to build up this channel after taking a few months off. I focus mostly on baseball history and videos like that, but I want to try making more content like this, so if this is something that you're into, be sure to comment on other ideas you might want to see me cover, and I'll see you next time.